This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Kyo Maclear. Kyo is an author, and her latest book is centred around family secrets, her mother, and how gardening shaped their relationship, and helped Kyo frame their mutual experiences. The interview begins with Kyo introducing herself and talking about her background.
My name's Kyo Maclear, and I'm based in Toronto, Canada. I was born in London, England, to a Japanese mother and a British father. And I am an author of novels, children's books, and I guess creative nonfiction as well. And I teach at the University of Guelph in Toronto in the creative writing MFA.
Lovely. So you've got a new book out and it's called Unearthing, a story of tangled love and family secrets. I don't want to give too much of it away, to be honest, while we're talking today. But can you just briefly sum up what the premise of the book is?
Sure. It's very much a hybrid memoir. It's part genealogical mystery, part essay on kinship, and the last part, I think, is the part that will probably appeal to your listeners most. It's a kind of personal botanical history. And it begins in 2019 when I took a DNA test and discovered that the father who had raised me wasn't biologically related to me, which was a complete shock. And he had just passed away 3 months prior. So he wasn't around for me to ask questions. And so part of the story follows the thread of that discovery. And it very much becomes a kind of DNA detective story. But that's kind of the plot. But beneath that layer, there's also a layer about a garden, which became like a meeting place for my mother and I, who is around and was actually the only person who was kind of around to tell me what had actually happened.
Yeah, and the timeline, it covers COVID, I think. So it's topical, obviously, because we all went through that together, and it's significant because of that. I mean, how much of an important backdrop did that play to the events?
Well, I mean, in many ways, it shaped certain aspects of it. Certainly, I mean, we were all kind of in our pods of isolation, and I made this discovery, and a lot of the things that I might have done otherwise, like kind of reaching out to my new genealogical family, weren't possible during that period of time. But also I found it was a period of time in my city and probably around the world where a lot of people were going to ground. There's a sense that everything was really unsettled and that the world was changing kind of dramatically. And for me, I think I was going through an existential drama of my own, in addition to the kind of drama that was experienced globally. And my first instinct was to kind of want to put my hands in the earth, kind of feel the kind of gentle rotations of what was happening in my garden. And so I think in some ways that feeling, that sense of being unsettled, kind of listing without a kind of firm story, was something I was experiencing both personally and kind of, I guess, socially in the larger kind of global picture.
And how much did you garden before the timeline of this book? Were you already a passionate gardener?
No, not at all. I mean, I always, to be honest, always thought of it as my mother's thing. And in hindsight, she had made many gardens over the years. We had moved often. In fact, one of the kind of underlying threads of this book is this feeling that we were very unsettled as a family. We were kind of, I mentioned that we were always like criminals on the lam, packing up and moving suddenly. So we were changing house a lot when I was growing up. But my mother always created these really beautiful gardens. And it was really odd because she wasn't much of a homemaker. Like, she wasn't interested in domestic things. And I think the garden was just this place adjacent to the house where she could do some tending, but also maybe escape domesticity in a certain way. So that became her place. And I always associated it with her and didn't have much interest in gardening, to be honest. Like, I was very much interested in my father's line of work, which was, he was a war reporter and he was a kind of big protagonist. And I was very much interested in storytelling. And I kind of thought my mother's passions were a little bit quiet and they didn't interest me as much. I also think, in retrospect, that I kind of tended to see the garden as backdrop. And then everything changed. Like, I kind of unearthed this secret in our family, and it actually made me reassess what I had considered background, because I realized suddenly that my mother had this kind of large plot story and was actually quite a large protagonist. And I'd always seen her as kind of the background to my life, kind of scenery in the way that I think many women are seen often, especially of a certain generation if they're homemakers. And so I guess the realization was that we shouldn't underestimate the people that are in our scenery. I mean, for many reasons, I ended up turning to the garden.
It would be possible for me to over analyze the significance of the gardening in terms of the journey that you went through personally. But I think two things that struck me was one, that the garden is very grounding. And the other is that I think there was maybe a sense of frustration that you wanted answers and they weren't as forthcoming as you might have liked. And so I think that the garden is a really great lesson for many of us in patience and going with the time and the developments kind of as and when they need to happen. Is that something you felt during that time?
Oh, yeah, you nailed it. Absolutely. I mean, I think the garden was many things. One thing it was a place for me to meet my mother on her own terms because I really did want to get my story. And she was very reluctant and she wasn't kind of a reliable storyteller. She would, her version of facts would change all the time. And it was very frustrating, but I was also kind of going at it in a very interrogative way. And my mother wasn't responding well, and things were kind of shutting down in our relationship. So the garden was almost a place, that we came to almost out of frustration on my part. Like she basically suggested, like, let's go to the garden and sit. And I think that what I realized is exactly what you said. I learned kind of lessons of patience. I learned to kind of let go of that storyteller mindset, which was very controlling, kind of narratively directive, and kind of surrender to what had to happen, which was things had to happen at their own pace. I couldn't kind of dig furiously for answers. And also, I mean, in the end, I also had to kind of make peace with what had to be left kind of in the deep, dark soil, things that would never be answered completely. And so the garden, I mean, I didn't expect this, but it did become a place where I did find a degree of peace. And also, I think it triangulated things in my relationship with my mother because instead of, facing each other frontally, like sitting her in the hot seat and asking her a million questions, we were in the garden and our attention was focused elsewhere. And so the conversations were happening shoulder to shoulder, and she was the expert. So I think she's always been a little bit reluctant to kind of engage in storytelling. And my passion for writing and books has always been a mystery to her. But I think meeting her in a place where she had the control and she was the person who held the knowledge was really a bit of a power shift. I mean, I have to say, mention here that my mother's first language is not English. And so I've always had more facility in the countries that we've lived in than she has. So I think that was really quite dramatic. And also just to be able to see how much my mother learned and knew about gardening almost osmotically, because I don't remember her ever, studying horticulture, but she knows so much. And I mean, I have to say, like, I mean, I was a little hesitant to come on this podcast because I feel a bit of imposter syndrome because I still know very little about gardening and plants. I love being in the garden and I love plants, but it wasn't like a kind of transformation where I suddenly became, well versed in everything. Like I still feel like I have a lot to learn and I'm still a notorious plant killer. And so, very much imposter feelings, but I don't think that was the point. And I have to say, like, I do see now too, because there was a little bit of distance between my mother and I. And partly it was that she never really expressed things openly. Like she wasn't openly affectionate. We weren't really intimate in terms of conversation. And just to be able to look back and see all the love that she'd poured into these gardens that kind of fed me and nourished me was a reminder that love can be expressed in ways that aren't always immediately legible, like that we don't always know how love appears in our lives. And I kind of been taught to see love in certain ways, like that parental love took the form of, hugs and kisses and open I love yous and, even interest in what you were doing and questions about school. And that was never the case with my mother. And just to be able to kind of backtrack and think about it differently was also really helpful in healing.
For me, I think the more you start to learn about gardening, the more you can become a little bit overwhelmed because there's this canon of knowledge and literature around it and history. And it is a vast subject with so much of a rich tapestry of, people and places behind it. But for me, I find the best gardens are always the ones where somebody's personality comes through. And I think that in terms of your mother's garden is particularly significant given her artistic background. And one of the things that I was trying to picture when I was reading your book was what her gardening style was. I mean, can you talk about it at all? Did she have a specific style that you noticed through all of her gardens?
I would say that she was very plant focused. She wasn't very interested in flowers, or she wasn't as interested in flowers. She was interested in variations of green. And that's kind of it's a realization when you realize there are infinite shades of green. Once you start to kind of sit in a garden, what might have just seemed green becomes so interesting and almost like lysergic. Like it's just amazing. So, but also her gardens were very shaggy. Like I guess there was a kind of degree to which she was kind of interested in the Japanese garden, but they weren't heavily manicured. And so she might have like clumps of like horsetail or fern, and they just kind of get overgrown. And in the book, I talk a bit about the kind of ethos that Derek Jarman had. There's a quote that I quote about shagginess in a garden, and if it's not shaggy, it's not worthwhile. And so I think my mother really, she wasn't overly controlling. She also would do this thing where sometimes she'd have like aggressive species and she'd plant another aggressive species nearby and kind of let them duke it out. Like it's just she just had her own way, and she'd often incorporate kind of features like rocks and things like that. And I mean, I have to say that they were really beautiful, but they really stood out in the neighborhoods we lived in, which were very much about kind of manicured lawns and kind of clean rows of flowers. And that wasn't my mother's style at all. And so the garden really was, I think, to some people really compelling, but to other people was a bit of a blight in the neighborhood. So but this was always her way. Like in everything in her life, she's always kind of followed different drummer protocols. Like she's always been her own person. So this kind of makes sense in terms of her personality.
And there's a quote actually that I jotted down, and I wonder if it does relate to your mother's kind of, it's almost like a rebellious style of gardening, but it's not just the sake of it, it's just her individual style. And there's a quote that says, "What if a woman in a garden is not posing, but simply widening her boundaries?" What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that's a kind of section where I'm talking about all the images that exist of my mother posing in these kind of beautiful garden settings. There's a whole kind of archive of photographs. My mother was quite glamorous and led quite the jet set life with my father. And there's just this kind of these stunning photographs of her. And I think there's a point at which she actually steps out of that role of posing against kind of scenery and actually starts to engage in gardening and getting dirty. And there's a kind of agency to that where she steps out of the frame of, the kind of beautiful, picturesque woman into this role of gardener, where suddenly she's like, first of all, she's elated because she's so happy and it's fulfilling this art passion that she that has been kind of stymied because she was an artist when she met my father and then kind of put that on hold to support him in his career. And so suddenly she has an outlet for all of her creativity. And I think that, what I mean by widening her boundaries is that I think it really put her into a conversation with life, right? And with seasons and with people that she encountered through the gardening world. And it gave her a whole other role in the world that she didn't have. And it kind of got her out of the house too. Like, I mean, literally, but also, she became very interested in painting again through the garden. And there's a section in the book where I talk about her love for Monet. And, my parents ended up splitting up. And one of the first things she did was she went to Giverny to visit Monet's garden because she had loved it from a distance. And this became this kind of rite of passage where she went there and, she went to the gift shop on her way out and bought one plate, a really beautiful kind of yellow and blue plate that she kept that was almost like a kind of symbol of her new independence. And she really had this kind of renaissance at that point, became, much more avid as a gardener, but also as a painter. And so I think it's that transition from being this kind of passive kind of object of I guess, desire in the world to becoming the subject. So that's kind of what I was talking about in that line.
So your mother, obviously, her inspiration in the garden translated into her visual art. For you, I think it's more obviously the written word. Do you think your gardening style has been shaped by your mother's gardening style, or, is it very different? Is it similar? How has that kind of informed your gardening experiences?
I think it's very different, to be honest. Like my mother, and I mentioned this in the book too, was very much interested in plants that she'd kind of grown up with in Japan. So there were a lot of imported plants, kind of non-native species, non-indigenous species. And I've become very interested in thinking about the garden as a place of sustainability and a place that ties into the history of where I live, which is, indigenous and Anishinaabe. So I've been kind of focusing on planting native pollinator species, and also because I love birds and I love butterflies. So we've created a pollinator garden for the most part. And so it's very different, but my mother's contributed, and there are things that she really loves that are in the garden as well. And certainly, like there are a few stone features that are influenced by her, but I'd say it's even shaggier than her garden.
I think that you, like you said, you've embraced that ecological side of the gardening, and also you have this empathy, I think, towards plants too. And one of the things you wrote about was the fact that people sometimes take on house plants after people have passed away. And I have never ever thought about, these orphan plants and what might happen to these well-loved plants that have been cherished by people in the event that the original owner is no longer there. Can you talk about that? What you found with regard to these orphan plants?
I'm so fascinated by that. I mean, one thing that really struck me during COVID was the number of plants that had been orphaned in storefronts and restaurant windows. I ended up taking a series of photographs of these plants that were kind of trapped in these windows as businesses shuttered and kind of closed down. But the example that you're mentioning comes from a botanical garden in Toronto, and it's called Allen Gardens. And every year people donate plants that they've kind of found or come across or inherited in the wake of somebody's passing. And often the head gardener there will take these plants on. And there's some that have grown like over 30 years. And he mentioned at one point when I met with him that this woman who was in the terminal stages of cancer had come with a plant and was just kind of completely heartbroken that she had to give this plant away, but really wanted to ensure that it was taken care of. And so there was just a real transfer of emotion. And I don't know how he held all that feeling, but he did. Like he's a very quiet, laconic man, but I think he understood how important it was and to kind of hold that space for her and to kind of assure her that the plant would be well taken care of. It was, I think, it tremendously reassuring to her. And so a lot of these plants exist in the botanical garden now. And I mean, he didn't point them all out to me, but I saw a few, and, some of them have been there for decades. So I found that so beautiful. And just that there are these origin stories within the garden that you might not know about. It just kind of changed the way I looked at that space.
It's a really fascinating concept, and you could really dig into that, I'm sure. And you obviously have done work on it. Yeah, it really jumped out at me as very poignant and something that I'd just not considered before. And you also mentioned the concept of plant time. I wondered if you could expand on that a bit.
I think for me, plant time is kind of a deep time in the ecological sense. Certainly, if we think about certain plant species, when I read Oliver Sacks' book about the fern in the Oaxaca Journal, like you get a sense of the prehistoric and just these kind of long spans of time that I find really humbling. I mean, I'm also a birder, and so I get the sense from bird migrations as well that they've been happening for millennia, and just the sense that we're kind of tiny in the scope of time. And I think some people might feel diminished by that feeling, but I feel really reassured by it. And especially when things feel kind of upended in one's life or kind of even kind of globally, I think the feeling that something's perennial and also just something that recurs. And this has become a motif in my life, in my garden as well, that the recurrence of plants has been really reassuring to me because I know when certain perennials will arrive, and I know when spring comes, the snowdrops come first, and the spring ephemerals will come. And I find that really reassuring. And I think the patterning of time through the garden has been really beautiful for me, in particular, because One of the things we haven't touched upon is that my mother has dementia now. And there's a lot of repetition when you care for somebody with dementia. And I find that repetition tends to have a negative cast in our culture, like especially through caregiving. There's a sense that it's kind of mundane and rote and kind of soul deadening. I can't look at it that way because it's so much a part of my life. And it was when my father was dying as well, that I need to look at repetition differently. And the garden has given me another way of thinking about repetition in a really beautiful way, to see recurrence, to see pattern as something that kind of ties us to this infinite feeling of, well, time, but also relationality to other people, but also to other living beings. And that I find very anchoring. I'm not a religious person, so that's kind of like been my anchor.
We mentioned just when we were chatting before the interview started, and you mentioned Sue Stuart-Smith, who's obviously written a book about the therapeutic benefits of gardening. And I think that through your book, you can see so many examples of that in action, that the garden becomes a way of processing, a way of connecting, grounding, as I mentioned, all sorts of things that it feeds into your journey emotionally. And I wondered, how will your garden factor into your work going forwards, if indeed it does? Are you planning on incorporating it even more?
I came to the garden intuitively, and so I don't know where I'll go with it next. I tend to work intuitively, but I do write for children as well. And I have a book coming out this year called The Ghost in the Garden with Enchanted Lion Books in New York City. And it kind of really picks up on some of the themes in my adult book. And I mean, I can see that plants and gardens are going to be a recurring motif in my work. And I'm certainly really drawn to art and literature now that kind of focuses on the garden. I'm, as many of us are, very concerned about climate change. And I find that the garden's also kind of a wonderful place to talk to children about developing a sense of ecophilia, kind of a love of nature rather than a fear of it. Because I think a lot of children that I speak to have this kind of fear that nature and the living world is dying. And so there's an avoidance that happens when children fear something. And so just developing a place where they can love something has been really important. So some of my stories for children focus on that. And, I think also just the sense that it's a place where you can find a baseline and observe what changes are occurring at a kind of more carefully calibrated scale, and for better or worse, right? Like, I mean, there's things that I find really reassuring because there's certain spring things that happen in the city, in the plant world, but also in the bird world that, I find happening every year still. And I find that very reassuring. But I also see that there are things that aren't happening that should be happening. And I think that's just a way of being kind of wakeful and kind of having a sense of being called into account to kind of notice things more and maybe respond to things in a different way.
It did strike me listening to you then about passing information on to your children. And obviously this book is so centered around your mother. If you could thank her for one thing that she taught you around gardening, or mention something that you feel is important about what she passed on to you, can you pick anything that you would like to highlight?
I think that caregiving takes many different forms, but also I think from the artist's point of view that it's about letting go of ego. One thing you learn in the garden is that it's not about you. You can go in with ideas of what the garden should be, and you're quickly outwitted, by weather or by whatever occurs in the garden. And so just letting go of that control kind of mindset, which is hard, I think, for artists sometimes. It's certainly for storytellers, I think. And that has been such an invaluable lesson. I mean, in every way, like existentially, creatively, kind of spiritually. And so, kind of working with the garden rather than kind of working on the garden. I mean, I think this is probably completely obvious to any kind of seasoned gardener in your audience, but I think for me, that was a really profound lesson.
Apologies for the short and sweet pieces from me this week. As you can probably tell, I have a cold. So I'll just say thank you very much to Kyo for taking part in this interview, and thank you for listening. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.